Here we go. All right, welcome everyone. There's a little blurb in the chat. Some people who are, in particular, if you're an SLP or something like that, are using this to get some continuing ed hours. So if you do want a letter of confirmation, I put all that detail in the chat. This will be recorded and placed on our YouTube later. But it is my great pleasure to hear from Dr. Dan Merman, who joins us from University of Edinburgh. It's a lovely mid-afternoon time. And he'll talk to us today about associations and dissociations in the cognitive and neural structure of narrative discourse. So what I'll ask everyone to do is stay muted until the end, and then we can unmute and ask some questions. You're also welcome to put questions in the chat. I'll moderate that for Dan as we go here. Typically, we just wait till the end so we don't interrupt his flow, and then we'll do a little Q&A afterwards. So Dan, whenever you're ready, take it away, and I will pin you to the front.
All right, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to talk to this group. I know some of you, and it's lovely to see your names here. My background is my training was in things like speech perception and semantic cognition. So working on narrative discourse is kind of a new thing for me, just in the last few years. And so I'm still kind of figuring things out, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you guys who are really the experts in this area. So I hope to share what I've done and learn from you. Okay, so I decided to do a slightly silly thing and ask ChatGPT to explain spoken discourse and aphasia to me. And what ChatGPT, I'll summarize here. You can see the actual output from this aphasia. I told it to take the role of an aphasia expert. Yeah, it says, okay, discourse is flow of language that conveys a speaker's intended meaning. It depends on the type of aphasia and the severity of the damage. It includes difficulties with things like organizing and structuring language or ideas, generating content, expressing thoughts, topic maintenance, narrative coherence, using appropriate discourse markers and connectors, word finding, grammar, all these different things. It's a common symptom of aphasia, and it can lead to things like social isolation, emotional distress, decreased quality of life, and appropriate therapy can help. Okay, so I think ChatGPT did pretty well. And as this group is very aware, and as ChatGPT knows, this idea of fluency or spoken discourse or narrative discourse is multifaceted. There's a bunch of different contributing elements to it, from things like word finding to narrative coherence. So it's like a pretty broad swath of language processing, language production that's involved here. And it has quite big implications in terms of the actual life of a person with aphasia. So the studies I'm going to talk about are sort of my recent effort to work out what are the cognitive and neural systems that support spoken discourse or narrative speech. Okay. And when I started, having trained as a cognitive psychologist, cognitive neuroscientist, I started from kind of a theory-based place of thinking about from a theory of language, how would we break down the components of fluent speech, right? So if you ask someone to tell the Cinderella story, okay, they're going to have to, they've got this sort of narrative in mind. They're going to have to construct sentences from it. They're going to have to choose words to fill those sentences, those sentence frames, and they're going to have to articulate those words. And what we did was try to identify measures that would be as targeted as possible for those particular components. Okay. And I think reasonable people can disagree about the best way to do that, but the way we did it was, so for constructing sentences, we said, okay, so the minimal thing you need to do to have a sentence in English is a noun and a verb, okay? So we can ask, in the course of a narrative, what proportion of words are in sentences? That being at least a noun and a verb. They don't have to be complicated sentences, but they need to be valid grammatical sentences. For choosing words, we could say, okay, well, if you make a word choice error, you're going to make a semantic error, or maybe you can fail to retrieve a word entirely. And we can look at that in the context of object naming or picture naming, right? So now we remove the constraints of producing a whole narrative, and we're not actually caring about articulatory errors. We're just talking about word selection or word retrieval errors. And for articulation, we can focus on the word repetition and look at non-word errors or distortions, phonetic errors. Okay, so in this case, we're not even talking about semantic retrieval. All you got to do is repeat the word, and if you make errors on that. Okay, so we have 3 different measures. This is kind of collating across a bunch of different studies here, testing relatively large or moderate to large sets of people with aphasia with various left hemisphere stroke cases. Okay, so for the proportion of words and sentences, we find this, you have some information about the participants in this study. This frontal effect, primarily inferior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and some in inferior parietal. For the word choice, this anterior temporal effect that I think has been demonstrated now about 1 million different times. It was the early work here, but from Werner Schwartz's group was on semantic errors. More recently, we did a study with non-word errors, or sorry, with no response errors, so omissions, where we present a picture to people and they say, and you know, they're unable to come up with anything. You get the same anterior temporal effect. Okay. And then for non-word errors, we get this kind of post-central and inferior parietal. That's true for non-word errors like cat to cag, and also for distortions of phonetic errors. So not entirely different phoneme, but a distorted version of the intended phoneme. Get basically the same effect. Okay. So from that, we got this sort of 3-component framework, okay, across those different studies, where sentence construction, sentence planning is frontal, the word selection, sort of anterior temporal, and the articulation planning is inferior parietal. Okay. So I went through that pretty fast because, first of all, that's kind of old, and who likes talking about stuff that's been out in the literature for 4 years. But also because there's a very specific thing going on here, right? So we started out with this theory-based subcomponents, right? We decided based on theoretical grounds that these 3 things should be dissociated from one another, and then we went out and found those dissociations. Okay. When you go looking for dissociations, you're sort of bound to find them sooner or later if you look hard enough. It can be a little bit more difficult and perhaps more interesting to try to find associations, meaningful associations. And in this regard, I'm very influenced by work of people like Carolyn Patterson and Werner Schwartz, and Dave Plaut and Gary Dell, people who I've crossed paths with many times. So maybe it's not surprising that I'm inspired by them on this. And thinking about what does it mean? We have ideas about what it means when things dissociate, but what does it mean when things are associated with one another? And one particular kind of association that I worry about a lot is lesion size or severity. Okay, so severity is going to have a pervasive effect on language performance in aphasia. I think that's just an intuitive claim, right? If someone has a very severe aphasia, if someone has a very large lesion, they're going to kind of have trouble with any language task. Maybe some more than others, some language tasks more than others, but like it's probably going to be pretty hard for them to do most things. Okay, that's my intuitive claim, but also there's quite a bit of evidence to back this up. So a really nice study came out a couple of years ago where they looked at a large set of people with aphasia across different etiologies, and what they found was that severity was just the primary dimension of variability. And then in work that we did, where we were trying to come up with data-driven clusters, what we found was that there's a mild cluster that just separates out from everybody else. So severity is really an important dimension to be thinking about. And so you have, for me, the way that plays out is that I'm always thinking about, okay, I would like to believe that this is a measure of X, but what if it's just a measure of severity? We found in some of our work that lesion size is just as good and sometimes even better predictor than lesion location for especially for broad measures like the NIH stroke scale study. This is a study that I collaborated on that's under review right now. But also within left hemisphere stroke and aphasia, if you talk about stuff like aphasia quotient or picture naming, the best predictor is just how big the lesion is. The best neurological predictor is how big the lesion is. Kind of doesn't matter where it is. That's what this is results from studies we ran, where showing that pretty much anywhere in the MCA territory is predictive of these deficits. So the way one of the ways that we approach associations in my research group is using principal components analysis or factor analysis, basically trying to cluster measures based on their correlations. If two measures are highly correlated, then they're probably measuring something quite similar. And if they're weakly correlated, then maybe they're measuring different things. There's a particular version of that called a bifactor rotation, which assumes a general factor, which in this case would be severity, which contributes to all the measures, and then it estimates other factors, right? So the idea when you do a bifactor PCA, what you're saying is, I think this data set has some general component that affects all the measures in it. And in addition to that, there might be some additional variables that also contribute to specific subsets of those measures. So we did this kind of bifactor PCA using 21 behavioral measures. 13 of those came from QPA, which I imagine many people here are familiar with. The idea is basically to quantify the structural, syntactic, and fluency aspects of narrative speech. And we added, in addition to those 13, 8 kind of, I think of them as anchors. This is a factor analysis thing. You get better performance in factor analysis if you can if you put in some measures for known factors, right? So we know, so this is, because this is bifactor PCA, we know there's going to be a severity factor. So we put in a severity measure like WAB-EQ. Can you actually see my cursor, or should I do something more clever?
Move it again. I thought I saw it for a second.
Is that?
Yep. Yeah, we can see it.
All right. I'm gonna have a virtual laser pointer. So we have an actual severity measure. We have picture naming, which is not the same thing as severity, but is closely related to it. And we have semantics and phonology, which we know are potentially important components. And so we have some measures that will serve as those anchors. If any of the measures in QPA are closely related to severity, then they'll sort of glom onto this variable in the bifactor rotation. If any of them are close to semantics, then they'll glom onto these guys. And if they're close to phonology, they'll glom onto this one, right? So that's the value of having these anchors. If you know that certain factors are important, you can get better performance in PCA by including them in the set of measures. All right, so I already said this, the point of PCA is to discover these latent components based on correlations among the measures. So in this case, we capture about 70% of the variance in 4 components. That's a pretty typical result. It's for a PCA of this sort. It's neither a particularly large or particularly small amount in this kind of situation. And then each component is a linear combination of the 21 measures. That's called a loading. And that's how we go about interpreting the components or factors is based on which measures load on them. Okay, so I'll walk you through that now. So the first factor, and this is, since it's a bifactor rotation, this is going to be the general one. We called it complexity because a lot of the measures that load strongly on it, so you get the severity measure in there and P&T accuracy, but you also have these sentence length and utterance length measures, inflection index, and embedding index. Those are complexity measures. And then to varying extents, you get other stuff contributing to it. The second factor, we called it lexical syntax because it's just a small subset of syntactic measures that are at the lexical level. So proportion of verbs relative to nouns, proportion of closed class words, and proportion of pronouns. those are the strong contributors here. And so you don't have a lot of other kinds of things that you might imagine being syntactic. I guess you have a little bit of the determiner index, but like inflection accuracy, inflection index, or embedding index, right? So those are syntactic structural measures, but they're not really contributing to this one. It's more at the lexical level. And then we got phonology and semantics factors, but you get very little contribution of the QPA measures to those. They're quite distinct. So this is phonological errors and word repetition. This is semantic discrimination, semantic errors, and camels and cactus. Things like P&T accuracy contribute, and WAB-AQ to semantics, for example. But and this is a story of me having the wrong intuitions. I would have thought that semantics would play a much bigger role in narrative production, but I was wrong. Or at least the measures are not strongly correlated with semantic measures. Okay, so we took this large set of measures, we broke it down into these 4 components. Then we can look at what are the neural correlates or the lesion correlates of performance along these different measures, along these different, you can think of them as composite scores, essentially. So for complexity, not surprisingly, we get something very similar to severity. Okay, so it's this kind of big MCA region. You get superior temporal, you get parietal and frontal regions involved. For comparison, here's what happens if you just do that analysis with WAB-AQ. So this is what it looks like when you're literally using a aphasia severity measure. And this is what it looks like when you're using this composite measure that includes a bunch of stuff, a bunch of QPA measures of fluency and complexity of speech. It's basically the same. For lexical syntax, we get something quite different, this sort of weird frontal parietal. I think it's weird, frontal parietal result. This is not areas that are generally associated with syntactic processing. Best speculation I can come up with is that these are control systems that support retrieval and production of these words that are playing kind of a structural role and don't have a strong semantic constraint on them, but they're there to kind of help the structure of the language. And so to produce them, you need control support. That's honestly, that's a speculation. I don't know if that's what's going on here, but that's these are the brain regions we found that were associated with that. Okay, so summing up that study, okay, length and complexity of narrative speech is closely related to aphasia severity. Okay, this is the thing I was concerned about, that I might be, I might call it sentence length and think of it as a structural syntactic measure, but actually it's pretty much indistinguishable from severity, right? Behaviorally, the way that plays out is it's just very highly correlated with the severity measure, and neurally the way it plays out is that it's associated with a large portion of the MCA territory. Lexical aspects of syntax appear to be separable from severity, right? There's something they don't just become part of severity, right? Which would be different from a kind of like generic resource model of lexical syntax. They're associated with a kind of small set of frontoparietal regions in this particular study. And then we're speculating that they're control systems. Okay. One of the things about QPA, I guess I can mention also that phonology and semantics seem to be pretty separate from this. So QPA by design focuses on sort of structural or syntactic aspects of speech production. And what it doesn't necessarily focus on is the amount of information that's being conveyed. So nowhere, those measures were derived from participants telling Cinderella's story or another fairy tale. Nowhere in there was there a measure of like how much of the story they conveyed. Okay, it was just about how complicated were their sentences, how well structured were their sentences, how fast were they produced, or, words per minute. So you could alternatively ask questions about informativeness. And there's a great way of measuring this called the correct information unit approach that I imagine people are familiar with. You can just count the number of informative words in connected speech. You can also look at the speed of that by dividing CIUs per minute, or the efficiency with percent CIU. I think of that as efficiency. You can talk about it as informativeness. I'm not sure what exactly the right word is. So you have these sort of three measures. The way these data were collected, we have 10 different prompts across 3 different genres. So, you ask people like personal or procedural information. So things like, what do you usually do on Sundays, or how do you write and send a letter? Picture descriptions are the sort of familiar complex pictures like the cat and tree or the picnic scene. Picture sequence descriptions are, if you've heard of Farmer and his directions, or the argument. So it's a little bit like a comic strip with different pictures, and then the person's supposed to tell the story of what's going on there. So these are different ways of eliciting narrative speech. What we found was that there was quite high consistency across these different prompts. Because my first concern when we started working with these data was, what if you get like big differences between the prompts? We don't want to just like take an average of them, because maybe we would be losing a lot of useful information doing that. Turns out they're quite highly correlated, and they're only marginally higher within genre than between genres. So that tells me that you get more information from some of them than others, but people who do well with one prompt tend to do well with other prompts. Okay, so that tells me that if you average them together, you can get reasonably good composite scores. So that's what we did. Okay. Starting with quantity and speed. So this is number of CIUs. This is CIUs per minute. Correlation with lesion size. Not surprisingly, people with larger lesions tend to produce less of these. Okay, this is sort of the severity effect that we've talked about all along. The correlations are moderate. What I think is interesting, just to kind of highlight, that at the smaller end, right, there's a lot of people with not massive lesions that have huge amount of variability, right? So there's some people with relatively small lesions that are producing very few CIUs per minute, and some people with similar size lesions that are producing a lot. Okay, so that just based on the scatter plots, that suggests to me that it's not just a matter of lesion size. When we ran the lesion symptom mapping analyses, what we find is a fairly specific effect in the anterior dorsal stream white matter, so the anterior arcuate and the frontal A-slant tract, basically. Junhua Deng is the postdoc who's leading this project, and when he showed me these results, my first thought was, are you sure? Because what I expected was something much more similar to what we'd seen from when the QPA results, and then given this correlation, that we would get, like a big swath of MCA territory. And this was quite small. I was also worried that the white matter is not sort of where the processing happens, right? These are connections. So this kind of lesion symptom mapping is sort of not ideal for identifying that. So we did 2 other things. We did disconnection lesion symptom mapping, where you specifically look at when regions are disconnected, what is the effect of disconnection? Where does disconnection impact the performance? And then we did sort of a very old school approach, you might say, of just looking at amount of damage to different white matter tracks. And across these three methods, we keep coming back to the same result, right? So these three different analysis methods, we keep coming back to anterior arcuate and frontal A-slant are sort of the key regions for these two measures. Okay. So what we're getting at, or what we're starting to see as a pattern, is that when you look at structural measures like QPA, fluency is sort of in there as well, or what I think of as fluency, just sort of how long the sentences are and how fast they are, words per minute. You get a severity type effect. When you look at informativeness, you get a frontal connectivity effect. Okay, so it seems like they're different, right? That CIU and QPA measures dissociate. Now, they're different by design, right? Like the principle behind QPA is about quantifying structural and fluency information. And the principle behind CIU is to quantify the information content in the speech. So they're coming from with different goals. And so, but you don't want to just kind of buy into the jingle jangle fallacy, right? You don't want to just, because they're coming in with different principles, it doesn't mean they're actually going to accomplish different goals. And so here's a subset. This is a correlation matrix. There's 4 QPA measures. They're, I mean, I picked them to capture the two different things, right? So words per minute and mean sentence length are more in that sort of severity, complexity, fluency cluster. Proportion of words and proportion of pronouns are in the lexical syntax cluster. Here we've got the CIU measures, so number, CIU per minute, percent, and non-CIUs. Okay, they are to some degree distinct, but CIU number and CIU per minute are highly correlated with the QPA measures, right? So words per minute and CIUs per minute are, that correlation's above 0.8, right? They're very, very closely related to one another. And CIU number and CIU per minute are also quite strongly correlated. On the other hand, CIU percentage and non-CIU, they're going to be sort of related to one another, but not entirely. But they're quite weakly related to these other measures, right? So that those present, there's a potential here to try to pull apart these two elements of discourse, okay? If we're looking at, on the one hand, efficiency in the sense of CIU percentage, like what proportion of the words are actually informative on one hand, and then something like words per minute, right? So the correlation there is going to be 0.27, not particularly strong. And that's something more like fluency. Right, so that's what that scatter plot looks like. I think this is 76 participants. Here's percent CIU, here's words per minute. And, there's some correlation here, although, like this quadrant here is just mild cases, right? People who produce speech reasonably fluently, quickly, and mostly informative, right? So we can, but you can see like here, there's just a cloud, right? Like this is sort of all over the place, right? So you can take 4 cases, if you can think of it like almost like quadrants, and say, okay, so this like blue participant here, okay, that's someone who just kind of has a mild impairment, right? They're reasonably high words per minute, reasonably high percent CIU, and they also just kind of have a small, mostly subcortical lesion. So it's just like their aphasia is just not that severe, probably. I guess I haven't looked at their WebAQ, but based on this, and words per minute is highly correlated with WebAQ. Okay, so that case I sort of understand. Okay, that seems pretty sensible to me. This sort of pink fuchsia, not sure what the right name for that color is. Okay, that person is similarly fluent. All right, their words per minute are also pretty good, but their percent CIU is much lower. Okay, so they're saying a lot of words, but they're not producing a lot of information, at least as a proportion of the words that they're saying. And they've got this kind of anterior temporal lesion. Maybe what's happening here is a semantic impairment. right? And this kind of profile of relatively fluent speech, but with low information content, maybe that's somewhat what you might expect from someone with a semantic variant primary progressive aphasia or semantic dementia, right? Where the speech production is relatively fluent, but with a lot of non-specific words. This green case, that's a severe non-fluent production case, right? They're low words per minute and low percent CIUs, and they've got dorsal stream damage. So that's kind of sensible to me also. Okay, that's what I think of as a kind of conventional non-fluent aphasia. This red one is interesting to me, perhaps the most interesting. They're clearly non-fluent, right? They've got very low words per minute, but the words they do produce seem to be informative. Like they're hitting it every time. They've got a large lesion. I mean, this is like most of the perisylvian territory in here, right? So what's interesting to me about this case is what's the strategy they're using, okay? So they've sustained quite a lot of damage to their brain, right? They've got a large lesion. They're having trouble getting words out, but the words that they are saying, they're making them count, right? And what are they doing to make that happen? And I think that's interesting from a strategy perspective. I think that's interesting from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, and I think it could potentially be interesting from a clinical perspective, because if whatever this person is doing is allowing them to communicate more effectively, despite a large lesion and a strongly, non-fluent impairment, then maybe that's a useful strategy that we could teach other people. I used "we" a little loosely there. So that's the direction. One of the next steps that we're going with this kind of work is to look at the transcripts. So this was just behavioral and neural data that I'm showing you. We're going to track down the transcripts of these people and try to better understand what are the actual strategies that they're using to communicate and what's happening here that's allowing them to be successful, at least on this one measure, when they're not successful according to another, or very impaired according to a different measure. Okay, I promised to tell you about associations and dissociations in cognitive neural structure of narrative discourse. Starting from a very obvious place of fluent speech production requires coordinating multiple systems. Although phonology and semantics are important for speech production, of course, but they seem to be distinct both behaviorally and neurally from discourse production. I should say this is for someone who spent, I don't know, the first 10 years of his career studying phonology and semantics. This was a grave disappointment. I was hoping that all of language relied on those too, and it's been a tough lesson to learn. Length and complexity of speech output are closely related to aphasia severity and lesion severity. And this sort of confirmed my, I don't know if it counts as skepticism or not, but I often, my first question is that impairment just something that you could explain with aphasia severity or lesion severity? And I think measures like length and complexity of the speech output can be pretty well explained in those terms. The lexical aspects of syntax seem to rely on frontal parietal systems, possibly control for retrieving words that serve structural rather than semantic functions. People who are interested in syntax might find that interesting. But for me, that sort of ends up being a bit of an edge case with respect to understanding spoken discourse. That like the lexical aspects of syntax are sort of like, okay, so you're getting some nice structural elements, but they're not critical. The frontal white matter are critical for quantity and speed of informative words in connected speech. So these are the CIUs and the number of CIUs and the CIUs per minute. And this is quite a stark difference, from the length and complexity result. related to that is that fluency and informativeness can be dissociated. So on the one hand, you have how fluent and complex the speech is, but then to some extent, on the other hand, is how informative it is. These seem to be behaviorally and neurologically dissociable. I think that's something that's very interesting because it sets up thinking about communication strategies and functional communication, and that's what we're working on now, is trying to think about measuring those things and trying to understand how they relate to these different cognitive and neural components. And that's what we'll be working on for, I think, the next couple of years. I mean, maybe longer, who knows. Thank you. I flew through that quite quickly, and I just want to acknowledge all the people who made this work possible. Chi Chen and Junhua Ding were postdocs who've worked with me over the years. Erica Middleton's a longtime collaborator. Melissa T and Elena Zivkola-Taku are postgraduate students here in Edinburgh. And of course, Myrna Schwartz, who sort of gave me the opportunity almost 15 years ago now to pursue research on aphasia, and that has inspired a lot of my thinking about aphasia. So thank you all for listening. We have lots of time for discussion.
Perfect. Let me pause our recording, or I guess stop it is fine.